Thank you, disembodied girl voice.
I know, such a recording in progress. She's
Yeah.
quite scary.
She's terrifying sometimes,
Yeah.
because there's just no emotion to it. There's no emotion to it. She just tells you. It's not like a friendly, like, hey everybody, how you doing?
I don't know. I mean, she's got that slightly American friendliness to recording in progress. Slightly threatening, though. I don't know.
It is
It's
slightly.
I think in an English accent it'd be recording in progress, and that's a bit more. So behave.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I like about the British and the African accents is the politeness and the manners in them.
Yeah, well, we bother to articulate all our vowels, which you don't. You kind of just go on the roll, which is lovely and charming. It's very chill, very relaxed, very friendly, but no, we're quite clipped. South Africans are the most clipped because they've got the little, like they add a little syllable at the end of everything they say. So it's yeah, accents. Why are we talking about accents? We're meant to be talking about pirates. I get distracted. I apologize.
No worries. I get distracted too, and I just keep rolling with it. So pirates. You
Arr.
wrote Herg. You wrote you've written about pirates. I know there's one.
Yeah. So I'm basically one of these people who isn't a real historian. I get told I see myself as a history fan, but my job is I am a presenter. So I've presented Making History on the BBC. You might have heard of the author Tom Holland. I was his co-presenter for a while on like a flagship Radio 4 history show. And so it's the best thing because I get to go and basically get spoon fed the most interesting parts of history because I go out and interview historians. I can go to the National Archives and they will hand me documents that Queen Elizabeth I has signed. And I think that's a bit like, kissing somebody, holding something they've actually touched. That's like, basically I've married Queen Elizabeth at this point. It's pretty cool. But what I do is I write basically historical fiction for children. So I go from ages. I've got some ones from 6 till 9, which are the Time Machine Next Door series, and I do later really in-depth historically accurate. I want to say historically accurate. This book, the pirates in it are real. The ships, all but one of them, are real. They are where I say they were in history. Mainly, I've sided with Colin Woodward and other historians about where they would have been at this one point. Charles Vane turns up to NASA a little bit early, but shh. But I've really make an effort to tell the real story and try and get kids interested in the actual history rather than the Hollywood representations of the history, or indeed what they learn about it at school, which is quite biased. For example, my first book I did was actually about the suffragettes and the women's right to vote protests here in the UK. And when I learnt about that at school, it was very, very dry. It was very, these women made very good signs and they lied up and they were very boring and very normal. And then they got sent to prison where they starved themselves, which I can relate to as a kid. I like cake. Um, and then they went to prison. They did all these things, and then one of them got hit by the king's horse, and then eventually the men gave them the vote, and that's the story that I was told. And then I found out about all the bombs. I found out about all the burning down the houses. I found out that they were trained in mixed martial arts and would beat up police officers. And I thought, this is a far better story to tell the children. Violence sells. So when I wrote Blackbeard's Treasure, what I really wanted to do, because I've been involved in sort of pirate history a bit. I was part of a documentary for Netflix called The Lost Pirate Kingdom, which you can still go and watch. And I'm one of these annoying people who picks apart films and ruins other people's historical fiction. When I came to write this, I really wanted to represent the pirates as they actually were, rather than this sort of like ghostly fantasy stuff, which is fun and I don't dislike it, but it isn't what they were really like. And that's what I really wanted to sort of get across with this book. So that is me.
All right. And since that is you, I am I'm gonna ask, why did you particularly write Blackbeard?
Mainly because he's my favourite, because he embodies what I see as a pirate more than other pirates do. So you've got really violent people like Charles Vane, who are just really quite nasty. Um, but what I like about Blackbeard is that, I chose, I'm calling him Thatch in this book. He's probably called Edward Teach, but it depends who you read. I put him coming from Bristol, which we think is most likely. I put him coming from quite a well-to-do family as well, which is really interesting because the whole one of the most famous pirates out there is a guy called Steve Bonnet, who was I think he was no, he wasn't Bermudan. He was Barbados. He's from Barbados, and he had his own plantation. He was a well-to-do guy, and he spent his own money to build a pirate ship, which is just like what? And then he sort of lived out this sort of fantasy of being a pirate. And these were because the sort of understanding is, oh yeah, these were men were desperate. They'd been left behind after the Spanish War of Succession, and they didn't have any work. This is why they had to become a pirate. Black Sam Bellamy is one of these men who was sort of desperate and trying to seek their fortune and that sort of thing. But you get this sort of idea that actually there's a lot of sort of gentleman pirates, and there were people with decent backgrounds a little bit. I mean, Jennings is one of the ones who have sort of, who's quite well to do. And that sort of goes against that sort of desperation thing. And Blackbeard particularly understood the politics of piracy very well. So the whole reason we know of him, he's called Blackbeard. We don't know him as Edward, we know him as Blackbeard simply because he used his physicality and he used his ships in a way to be the most scary thing that you could possibly imagine, so that he would never have to fight. All these, you hear these rumors about him that he could cut a man in two with one swish of his sword, and there's no evidence actually that he killed anyone directly at all. There's no murder happening that we can actually pin on him. The whole thing is this sort of like flamboyant peacock that basically terrifies other ships into giving him their stuff. And just what a brilliant commander he must have been to keep everybody together, because he had a fleet. I mean, my book's set in 1717, 1718. And by this point, he was so successful that he could just, go anywhere and do anything. And this is obviously what led to his downfall, because all the success meant that, the government couldn't ignore him anymore, or rather, it's not even the government, it's private companies couldn't ignore him anymore. So they sent a guy called Woodes Rogers down with a fleet to stop him. And, this is basically what my book's about, is that decision that the pirates have to make. Do you take the king's pardon, which is basically giving you legitimacy, saying you can keep all this stuff, you just got to stop being a pirate, and then that's that, or do you carry on and try to basically keep living the dream and keep this it going? And I think that sort of dilemma of what is good, what is bad, and he just encapsulates that particular sort of moment in history when the Caribbean is rife with pirates and nobody could stop him until Rogers comes.
All right. It's interesting. And so, what time period, just quickly, are we talking about? From when to when is this pirate era happening?
Well, I would argue like there have been privateers, buccaneers, which basically just means people who barbecue. That's what buccaneer means. Really since the mid 17th century. So I'd say like the golden age of piracy, ho ho ho. Really, I personally think it is just after the Spanish War of Succession. It's about 17. I don't know, maybe 1713 to 1723 is that decade is where you get the most piracy happening. And by the time a history of pirates comes out in 1724, where everybody's reading about all of these pirates and getting all excited, that's kind of when it sort of stops, because it just becomes really difficult. They actually bother policing the Caribbean a bit more. And I am talking about the Caribbean here. This is where I'm focused on. So I would say, I mean, that's why I set Blackbeard's Treasure in the height of it. So 1717, 1718, just before Blackbeard meets his end. That's when I decided to do it, because it was such a unique time in history. Because what happened was, Spanish War of Succession. I don't know if you remember King Charles II, so inbred that his dad was his own great uncle, which is his the family Spanish family tree. It starts at two people, goes out like this, and it comes back down to one person, and that's Charles. And poor man, I mean, he dies in his 30s. He's unable to eat in front of everything. He's got a curtain in front of his face. His tongue falls out of his mouth all the time. He's unable to have any kids, which is the only job for a king to do, is to have a kid. And there's this massive war in Europe about who should take over the Spanish throne, because Spain is minted. It's getting all of its gold from the Americas. They, the constant ships coming over. It's one of the most powerful countries on the planet at this point, and everybody wants a say in who's going to take over the throne. So the British are fighting the Spanish, and they're trying to stop all the gold coming back through the Caribbean to Spain, because that's what they're using to fund their army. So they send loads of merchant ships. This is before there is a British Navy. It's not organized. So yeah, they're sending loads of merchant ships down, giving them a letter of marque, which is saying, hey, you can go and attack Spanish ships. You can keep whatever you like, just hurt them as much as possible. So loads of merchant vessels going down with their, dog's body of crews fighting the Spanish, and it's absolutely brilliant until this terrible thing called peace happens, and all the letters of marque are taken away, and suddenly there is absolutely no work for anybody to do. All the wages, which are already mean. I mean, a merchant seaman, just a general sailor, is going to get about £1 a month, which, considering that a maid, like a teenage girl living in your basement type thing and doing all the dog's body work, is getting paid £11 a year. A seaman is not getting paid a lot, and you're risking your life, and it is not nice work, and there's corporal punishment. It's horrible. But anyway, those wages get halved, so they can't survive. And they can't go and do jobs because, of course, all of the work on the farms, all the work building things, is all being done by this terrible thing called the transatlantic slave trade. So all the jobs are being taken up by slaves who are being worked to death at this point. So that it's not like they can just go get a job or do anything. So they're basically left in the Caribbean, no money to get home, no money to do anything. They're just dumped at ports. And of course, what are they good at? They're good at attacking ships. And so that's what they carry on doing. And that's why it's such a unique time in history, because there is no other time when you have commoners and quite well-to-do people having to work together. I suppose a bit like the First World War, when you get that sort of mix of classes, but there really is a mix of classes here where commoners actually go, actually, this is a bit of a meritocracy. I can actually, if I'm good at this, and if I can lead people, and if I can convince them, I can live like a prince. I can make an absolute fortune. And yeah, it's going to be a short, sharp life, but it was anyway. And at least this way, I get to do whatever I want, which is why you get characters like Blackbeard, who are just so, like, he would, like, my book starts off with a real event on the island of St. Kitts. Blackbeard, because he's heard what's happened to Sam Bellamy and the Widder, and he's heard that they've basically, a pirate ship sank, loads of treasure in the sea, only a few of the crew survived, and those few of the crew got hanged because Massachusetts people are evil. And basically, at this point, Blackbeard's enraged by this, and so he goes and just attacks anyone flying, a British flag, the King's colours, a Union Jack, is what he hates that. So he goes and attacks a sandy point on the island of St. Kitts. Doesn't take anything, just burns the entire sugar crop. Just does it. Why not? And what I've done is that my main character, Abigail, her dad's a plantation owner, and it was his sugar crop that Blackbeard destroyed. And then her dad becomes destitute, ends up getting himself killed. Her best friend thinks, well, hey, I'm no longer a slave. I'm going to go off to sea now. And she basically spends the book trying to get her revenge on Blackbeard, which is, and so I follow him through his sort of last journeys. And I won't tell you what happens at the end, but she is involved in some of the things that we're not sure why he did what he did. And the answer is my fictional character explains everything. But that's the beauty of being a historical fiction author, is you can really, put your opinion of why people are doing this out there as fact.
All right. So really quickly, so the Widow in the States is not actually, it's Sam Bellamy is not actually as well known.
Oh, really?
So what
Okay.
was so what was his relationship with Blackbeard?
Well, literally, they'd have known each other. So Black Sam Bellamy, very briefly, guy from Devon. I think he probably got pressed into being on a merchant ship, goes down, fights in the Spanish War, pretty much becomes destitute after the Spanish War of Succession. Ends up, I think, in Cape Cod, where he meets this girl that he wants to impress. Meets a guy called Paulsgrave Williams, who, and then they hear that there's basically a massive storm and a Spanish the basically a galleon goes down with a load of gold coins in it. The Spanish say, if you start looking for our lost treasure at the beach, we will come and kill you. And everybody goes, here, try and stop us. So he and Paulsgrave Williams and a load of other pirates go down to the Caribbean, try and find this treasure, do get quite rich, and then become pirates and then continue on. He gets the Widder is an ex-slave ship, I think. I can't remember how he gets that, but it's clever the way he gets it. And he has a sort of rivalry with another pirate called Jennings, so that it's really quite funny. He
Yeah.
runs rings around
So
him. It's
they
great.
all
Sorry, yeah.
so they would undress
Oh yeah, no, this
Bellamy's
is yeah.
yeah. His
Well, this is
favorite
yeah.
method of taking ships was he'd have his whole crew undress, and he traveled with, I think before the way he traveled with a lot of ex-slaves, and they
Yeah.
would all take their clothes off, and when the crew would see a whole bunch of naked ex-slaves ready to parlay, then they would go, all right, well, we'll surrender. And
Yeah.
most of the time, Sam would actually let people go. He'd go, all right, well, you can join us or you can go. We'll put you in a boat and send you off.
Yeah, he did this very famous speech, which he did on a captured vessel, trying to convince the crew there to for them to join his crew rather than here you can be the prince of the sea and or you can carry on in your virtual enslavement. Any man can do what I. And he managed to get a little 9-year-old boy to sort of join him as well. And unfortunately, the Widder got into a massive storm and sank. But he was incredibly erudite, and he really he gave this sort of speech about freedom that could only be in an American Hollywood film. I mean, he was just so sort of like freedom, and freedom meant robbing people, but still. Um, he was seen as a great good guy. He's an interesting character, Black Sam, but like you say, he did, he used these tactics, same as Blackbeard, who'd set his beard on fire and everything else. Blackbeard's too, 60% of his crew were African in origin. And if you are, coming out of Charleston with your lovely ship, having just delivered some slaves and going up to London now with your, your rum or your rice or whatever it is you're delivering, yeah, you're gonna think twice when you see an angry, half naked, African. I write. There's no evidence of this, but I write that you've got different people of different nations, but they're going to be singing some of their songs that they know. All of this, music of the Caribbean and music of in America is largely influenced by African origin. So of course they'd be singing. So you get the yo ho music mixed in with like Chi and like Yoruba and all of these different languages and all these different songs. And it would be terrifying if you were, thinking, okay, I'll just give you everything if you just leave me alone. Of course you would.
Yeah. Especially if they don't have any clothes on and they're ready to.
Yeah, and also having a big beard was not fashionable at the time. It was fashionable to be clean shaven. So the idea that you would be mad. It's one of the good things about you get depictions of pirates like Johnny Depp's or like you often get Blackbeard or you get in Treasure Island, you get these guys. Long John Silver, you get them overreacting with big wide eyes and acting manic, and I think that's pretty historically accurate. That's how they would be. In order that people just they know what we can't predict what they're going to do, they're crazy, they could just turn around and kill us all. We've got to try and sort of tiptoe around them a bit, and I think that was a very deliberate tactic they were using. Also they did have syphilis, so they were going a bit mad, but you know
Athletic sanity had a little bit to do with it. So actually, my next question is why do we know why syphilis went around so easily at that time?
well, there was a lot of unprotected sex, and unprotected sex wasn't just the fact that it's fun to have sex and why not. It's not just that they weren't thinking about the future because they literally thought, well, I could be killed at any day. It was a tactical thing. You needed a wife in every port. Blackbeard had several different wives on different islands, because if he was captured for a minor crime, he could have a character witness, and she'd be like, oh yeah, we know he's lovely, he's a really good father, and he does all of this and that. That's what you needed in order to sort of get off the minor stuff that otherwise, if you got caught for a minor offense, you could end up like Al Capone. He wasn't caught for what he did, he was caught for a minor thing, and that locked him up for it. Or if there were pirates, you get hanged. But yeah, so that's why I think that it was particularly, and also it wasn't understood at all as to, it was understood that it was sexually transmitted, but it wasn't really understood as a disease in the same way that we understand it. So it's very hard to avoid. Yeah, no, syphilis was a huge problem. So much so that Blackbeard, he had syphilis and was so, so overcome by it, he actually nearly ruined everything by holding up the town of Charleston just to get some mercury so he could just do something inappropriate with it. I won't tell you how he administered the mercury. Am I allowed to tell you how he administered the mercury?
Yeah.
Basically, it's historically accurate, guys, but if you don't want to listen, don't listen. So you'd get a needle, a long needle, and you'd put that needle all the way up into the bladder and inject it. Not nice. It's not. I've seen these needles as well. They're really quite like biros. They're thick. They're not nice. Anyway, so he held up the town of Charleston, which I do cover this in my book. I don't call it syphilis. I call it the pox, which is accurate, and I don't explain what he's going to do with the mercury or how he got the pox. But yeah, that's all in there for the kids,
Gotta get them while they're young.
Exactly. So, but he held up the town of Charleston for days, and his crew could have mutinied at any time because they were not making any money. This was just for drugs. And, that's the trouble when you're in charge of, all of these boats, when you have a fleet, it's really difficult to get them to do what you want when they need money and they need paying and they need everything else. So, the leadership, the sort of it's really quite scary being a leader. Often, I often think about the conquistadors going over and approaching the Aztecs, approaching the Maya, and that sort of thing. Not only are they just after the gold, they're just after the gold. They're after the gold for their own wealth, but they're also after the gold because their own men, if they don't get the gold, what will they do to the leaders at the time? There is that sort of element to it as well, as a sort of like underlying threat constantly by your own men, by your own crew, etc., which I think the pirates suffered from greatly. Of course, Blackbeard did really sort of like, he was very sneaky. He was such a pirate because he sold his crew in the end, because his crew was 60%, African. I don't know if they were all ex-slaves. Certainly some of them were, because when he got a ship which he renamed the Queen Anne's Revenge, but it was La Concorde, and that was a slave ship which he only managed to get because they were all the crew were diseased and they were basically drifting in the ocean, and so he managed to get them. And then of course, if you're a African coming over on a boat, do you want to be sold or be a pirate? I think most people would choose, even though it isn't ethically very good, to join a crew where you actually have some autonomy rather than go and be sold into effectively a meat machine where you're going to be dead within a few years from overwork. So that's why he had so many African crew. But there were African merchants around the place. Not everybody was slaves. It's a really interesting time in history. I mean, I sort of plug this book as a sort of like learning about the transatlantic slave trade, because even though this is a time where it's really kicking into gear and you're getting, loads of slaves coming in from Africa, because in the 17th century, there were a few, but you still have a lot of Irish indentured servants. But now sugar, you need the slaves to process the sugar. That is really getting going. And they're not racist yet, which is so weird. We sort of think of it as white people thought that black people were really bad and stupid and evil, so we used them for our slavery. That's not it at all. We needed slaves, we got the slaves, we used them, and then afterwards we're like, gosh, these people are being treated really badly. There must be a reason for that. And then racism came in as a way to justify why these people were being so inhumane, horrendous, and probably like the worst people who've ever existed. You know, it was really because the slavery's been throughout history, but the transatlantic slave trade is really like it's far worse than it's ever been before. And I giggle because it's really awkward to talk about, but it's really important we talk about it because, you know, it's one of the largest bits of research I did for my book was actually trying to get an idea because one of my characters, Boubacar, is, you know, a slave on the plantation. Abigail and him are friends because they're the only kids their age, so of course they're going to be friends, but they're not allowed to be, obviously, because Abigail's plantation owner's daughter, and he's like a boy who lives in the house and is a slave. So it's this sort of, you know, I wanted to get a really accurate things, and there are, because like by the mid 18th century, you know, it's really like thousands of people are being transported over, and of course they're not, you know, they're not taking just as random. They're not going in, raiding a village and coming out again. These are people being transported from all over Africa. So you've got really educated Muslim men and women who sort of like, they can read, they can write, they can do everything. So I'm just blanking on his name now. A guy called, what was his name? It's brilliant. It's Aluda, that's it, Aluda Kwano. He writes this amazing, like, you know, little thing of all the things that happened to him, how he, you know, works as a really nice guy, he managed to earn a bit of money as a slave, managed to buy his freedom, fantastic, and then just randomly gets picked up again by some other dude who's a horrible man, can't prove that, you know, he's a free man because that doesn't really mean anything if you a white guy wants to, so he becomes a slave again, then he goes to England where he's sort of freed for a little bit and then he becomes a slave again. It's madness, and just trying to exist as somebody who isn't white by the end of the century, it's almost impossible because the laws are literally, you're not included in the law at all. You've got no way of defending yourself, you've got no rights in court at all. But earlier on, in the early 18th century, those rules hadn't come in yet. It wasn't, you know, they were starting to be written, but they weren't there, and it wasn't judged on skin color yet. It was judged on slave and non-slave, and the slaves were all black, but they're all black from different places, and that it was so it was a real sort of like, it's really difficult to translate that without, because obviously our culture now is completely dominated by this sort of like distinction, and it just wasn't there at a time when you really thought, well, that's why they did it. No, they did it for money.
So was it because
they justified
serfdom was ended? Was that the reason why it all kicked off?
What, sorry, I missed the start of the question.
Serfdom. So was it started because serfdom ended?
It started, but well, no, really, it's to do with sugarcane. So you can, like, we had a civil war in our country where, you know, way before yours, you know, even existed. And our civil war, there was a lot of problems with Ireland, and we used Irish people as indentured servants, which is different to slavery, but not really. So basically, you become a slave for a certain set limit of time, say 10 years, and after 10 years, you'll be given a bit of land. So you're freed. Right. So brief, very mucked up history of slavery, right? William the Conqueror gets rid of Anglo-Saxon slavery. If you look at the Domesday Book, 1 in 10 English people were slaves at that sort of time, but he introduces serfdom. Now, serfdom is the idea that you belong to the land, so you're not allowed to leave the land, but equally you can't be sold separate to the land. So when a lord comes in, you have to work for the lord for a certain part of the year. You have common land where you can sort of like, you know, that's where you get your food from, and then for the rest of the year you have to work for the lord. So that happens. But what happens towards the 18th century, and it started to kick off in the 17th century, well, Tudor really, it was happening throughout, but it really starts to kick off in the 17th century, and by the end of the 18th century it's massive. It's this thing called land enclosure. So all the places where you know, people, your everyday people, they had their little tract of land which they would farm, and they'd go and work for this, you know, the lord, and farm his land, and then they'd pay some of their, you know, surplus to the church, etc. That's how the system worked. But then, you know, the lovely rich gentlemen of England wanted to expand their estates, so they took the common land, and that meant, poor people can't actually feed themselves off the land anymore, so they need money. And not only that, is that some of the common land enclosure was also their homes, which meant that they needed to pay rent. And that is why you have men going to sea, because they need money to feed their families. That is why you have people going to start to work in factories, because they need money in order to survive. Whereas previously, in Tudor times, you didn't need money to survive. You could just, live off the land. You'd work, or serfdom. Certainly, you didn't need money at all. And that is why you get this capitalism sort of coming in. And that's why, these people are desperate. So that's very different to being a slave, which is usually, if you're in Africa, usually there's been some sort of conflict with another tribe. Maybe you've got yourself into debt or whatever. You've become a slave for that reason. You get sold on to another family, get to the coast. They sell you with a group of you to some Spanish or English people or Portuguese people. Get put on a boat. And this is the first time you see the corporal punishment, because Aluda, he basically talks about how he walks onto this boat and he sees white people whipping each other, and he's like, that's how they treat the free people, right? Right, this is bad. This is the first time he's seen it, and he's been a slave for a while. Slaves in Africa would eat with the family at the table. They were still slaves. It wasn't great, but this is a whole different thing. And if that's how they treat free people, this is bad. But the reason you have slaves in the Caribbean is because of sugarcane. Because you can't get indentured servants to do it. You can get indentured servants to do tobacco, but once you cut sugarcane, the juice in it starts to sour, which means you've got a limited amount of time that you need to get that sugarcane to a press to squeeze all the juice out, and that juice is still souring, so you've got to get it straight into the furnaces and stuff to constantly turn it into molasses. And the whole process to get even a small plantation to get all of it processed is about 3 days, and that's 3 days with no sleep. Okay, that is not something anybody can physically do or willingly do. It's just impossible, which is why you need slaves to do it, because you can force them. And that's the only way it was happening. And loads of people, people just died. They would literally work to death. And that's why, and it's also, we could have lovely sugar for our tea. It's lovely. And I do make a point as well that, these plantation owners aren't, yes, on the surface, very wealthy, very cruel and evil and that sort of thing, but they're paying massive mortgages to London banks. And that's how it was all funded. So, and all these London banks, all these wealthy lords who own these beautiful estates, who's paying for that? It's people from Africa working themselves to death so that we have these beautiful parks here now. It is it's one of the, if anybody's interested, there is it's UCL have a reparations website where you can actually see, because when Britain, and to be fair to Britain, we did push for the ending of the slave trade, but when we did at the final end of it, so we stopped the trade, but we could still have slaves for a bit, and then we stopped being able to own slaves, and all those slaves were freed, and there were reparations, but not for the slaves, no, for their owners. So there are lists of how many people were getting money. Because and all these, people, plantation people in the Caribbean go, well, that's not fair because I paid more for my slave than you're giving me back. And I'm just like, you should be getting nothing.
Oh my God.
This is the thing. But there's these huge lists. And so it's so useful for your little, amateur historian who's trying to find out how the land was divided, because they all talk about the land. There's huge arguments about, well, I own this slave, and so that slave's child is actually technically mine, even though I gave it to that wedding. And, it's all there. And you're just like, oh my God, these are people, guys. What is wrong with you? Anyway, yeah, so it's just absolutely mind-blowing when you look at it like that. But these reparations, get this, Americans don't know this. So the British paid, and said, okay, so you've lost your property, so we're going to pay you for your property over a period of time. We, as a UK nation, stopped paying the slave owners and their heirs in 2015.
Whoa.
Yeah. I mean, all I'm saying about British history is the Second World War does a lot of heavy lifting for us. We're not good people. It's amazing. It is amazing. Yeah.
God.
Yeah.
Oh my God. All right.
It's mad, isn't it? And you're just, yeah. I mean, I personally find it absolutely appalling, but um, but
Well, I mean,
that
it's appalling, but there's definitely like a very comical nature to it.
yeah, it's,
Like when you go through the fine tooth and comb of history, you get to find out just how crazy it really is.
it is utterly nuts, and
It's like,
that's the beauty of it. I mean, how this is the thing that annoys me when you watch a pirate film is okay, like Pirates of the Caribbean, you see African people in there, but they're the interesting ones. I want to know about, what are you doing there? Were you a merchant? Were you a slave dealer yourself? Were you a freed slave? Are you a maroon slave? What's going on? These are, what languages do you speak? Who do you, because this whole idea that slaves could talk to each other. No, they're all from different parts. Some of them be speaking different languages. And everybody, had to learn all sorts of different languages. There was so, it's just mad, just how these people sort of, survived. Because I think that's one thing you can learn. If you learn about pirates, there are a lot of people, trying to be as good as they possibly can and just failing because of the circumstances they're in. It's impossible for them to do the right thing. Because there's just no options other than just to be brutal and horrible, or to steal, or to run away from your duties, or to, there's just nothing where anybody can make a clear cut. This is a good decision. There is none.
there isn't any. Oh my God. Wow. Wow. It's the catch 22 of
Yeah, yeah,
the
literally
1700s.
is.
Oh
Because
my.
if you came from like Devon, like Sam Bellamy, and like say you were from a big family and they can afford to feed you because of the land enclosures and stuff, so and you went down and see if you could get any work, in another thing, you basically got press ganged onto a merchant ship, and then you had to fight the Spanish. You don't care about the Spanish. Why do you have to kill a load of Spanish people? But whatever, you hate Spanish people, you know that, so let's go and kill Spanish people and get their treasure. And then you just get abandoned in the Caribbean with no options, and then and then you end up somehow in Cape Cod and you're falling in love with a girl. Why not go down and rob some treasure that's already been, left on the beach? And yeah, what we're doing is scaring a few people with, like, by getting our, chests out and beating them and telling them to sort of like stop and give us their stuff. It's not that bad, is it? Is it? Yeah.
That was
And when
bad.
you can see the injustices of the world, it really isn't. But
Yeah.
yeah.
So I mean, it's kind of ironic. It's like a weird comedy too.
Yeah.
But speaking of the Caribbean, so when I was 8 years old, pirates became really cool for me because
Mm.
Pirates of the Caribbean came out at that time.
Of course.
And
Yeah.
so that was the first time I got to see pirates be heroes on camera. But the interesting thing is there's also like a really big supernatural element to the story.
Mm.
Um, were pirates superstitious people? Do they believe in magic, sort of strange stuff like this?
I think that you've got several different mixes here. So you've got the fact that sailors are incredibly superstitious people in general, which when you think about it, you're on a bit of wood floating around with nothing to help you or stop you other than, a bad storm and you're dead. It's just random, it's scary. So of course you can do everything you can that you think superstitious, to try and stop that happening. Or try and get the fates to be in your, and also you've got this terrible thing that you're doing. So okay, I'll do the, and then you've got the different cultures as well. So particularly on a pirate ship, when you have people with African religions coming in, then, and you've also, it's the start of, like religions like voodoo and that sort of thing, because it's the Catholic mixing in with the African, and you get all of these different, sayings and charms. You get the different songs as well. So all of these, things feed into that superstition and feed into ways of trying to control an uncontrollable situation. But you've also got this thing that you've turned the world upside down. So when you have to understand that Britain in particular, sorry, England in particular, has been under a serfdom, as you were saying earlier. And the idea that you'd have days, for example, in England, which were topsy-turvy days, celebrations like May Day, celebrations like Christmas, where you'd have things like the altar boy pretending to be the bishop. You'd have people, not for racist reasons, but because they were white, they'd put black on their faces. The men would dress as women. It was a topsy-turvy day. Everything was weird. Belief in fairies was really big. All of these different things were coming in. And when you have a ship which isn't this hierarchical system, so it isn't the captain, the quartermaster, and everything else, and the boatswain all the way down to the waisters, right? It isn't that. It is everybody has an equal vote and say in what goes on, and we only follow the captain because we voted for the captain. And when I say everyone, if there are women on board, they have an equal vote. If there are children on board, they have an equal vote. African, black people, they all have an equal vote to the captain. And he only gets like twice the amount of wages that they get when we plunder. I mean, only twice. I mean, imagine if your CEO and your, corporate job only got twice what you earned. My goodness, would you be wealthy? This is this is it, and it's a complete topsy-turvy. They've just turned the world upside down as well. So there are no rules anymore. This is when you get people questioning, well, maybe people aren't better bred than me. Maybe the class system's a bit wrong. If commoners can do what gentlemen can do, the whole thing. So I think that really sort of so trying to assemble some sort of control and trying to form some sort of almost religion about the ship and about the rules does make a lot of sense, because they are completely throwing everything overboard, literally.
Okay. All right.
Whether they believed in an actual kraken, maybe, why not?
Yeah, no, no, it's interesting. It's a very interesting way to look at it. I didn't think of it as like, oh, here's kind of like how a high schooler has a very small world of just school, vacation. At this age, this happens. You go to a different school, you finally get to learn how to drive. And then when you're 18, you graduate high school, and it's like, okay, time to go find out what's out there.
Yeah.
And this, in many ways, is just that thing where people get to go out into the world and find out just what's out there.
Yeah. And it is, and like Black Sam Bellamy, sort of like, I'm a prince of the sea. This is amazing. I don't need to my parents don't need to be kings in order for me to have wealth or for me to have status. I've earned my own status. That is a new concept. It really is. And without these sort of stories, and everybody's so interested. This is why, everybody's heard of these pirates, is because everybody's like, oh my goodness, what are they doing? It's just utterly scandalous and utterly like surreal that people would be doing this. So that is why you get all of these, books like I think I can't remember what it's called now, but the it's not a brief history of pirates, but the history of pirates, or the general history of pirates. There we go. Gosh, Izzy's brain. The general history of pirates comes out in 1724. Okay, with all the illustrations of all these famous pirates who are only alive like what 3-4 years ago. These are, I think Charles Vane, there's literally people in there who are still alive, I think, when the general history of pirates comes out. And they're celebrities because they're doing these impossible things that completely are outside this world. And without that sort of popularity, go, oh, we can vote for people who lead us, and it doesn't really matter where you come from. Does that sound a bit American to anybody? Does that sound like revolution? I don't know if you'd have had these amazing, I don't know if you'd have had the French people chopping their own king's head off without pirates and those stories influencing them.
It is very influential. I mean, I know that pirates were very crucial in the American Revolution because in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, there's a church, St. John's Church, Episcopal Church, and I think almost all of their religious artifacts, I know that at least their baptismal font, and I think it's their altar as well, was stolen directly from England. The
Oh,
pirates
nice.
just happened to be passing by the sinking ship and rescued the artifacts in time for God.
Well, that's really good of them because God would have missed those. Hopefully, you left a few red coats in the ocean. You never know. Um, but yeah, no, it is. It is. I mean, I it's one of the things that researching for historical fiction is, I think, a lot more interesting also, because we've talked about these sort of big thinky concept things, but the just general day to day of living on board a ship and how wrong the movies get that, and how still everything looks, and how crowded it was on a ship. You didn't have a hammock for yourself, you had a hammock that you'd change in between shifts, so somebody else would be sleeping in your hammock while you were working. And when they was, everything was so cramped and so living in each other's pockets, and just utterly stinky, and utterly, and water, you can't keep water fresh for more than a couple of days at sea, and so you'd be drunk the entire time while sailing this massive wooden vessel. It's something, that I know there's a few biologists, doctors and stuff, who sort of say, if you think about how much the average person was drinking, even during pregnancy, and what we know that does to fetuses, and how it erodes that sort of empathetic part of the brain, it does sort of explain why you get men like Christopher Columbus going, oh, the people of the Caribbean are the nicest people I've ever met. They are so kind to each other. They don't seem to have a very strict hierarchy. They share everything so nobody goes hungry. That's what he wrote, something along those lines. Next sentence, they would make excellent slaves. Just completely, they're like God's people. They would make brilliant slaves. There's just no empathy there at all. Another thing I've noticed as well is how the pirates who come from much less gentlemanly backgrounds, so not the Stede Bonnets, not the Blackbeards, which is not the Jenningses, but the Charles Vanes, but the Bartholomew Roberts a little bit as well. These guys, much more vicious, much more violent because they've grown up with it. They've grown up being used to being, oh, you're going to stand over there, you get hit. There isn't the prison system, there is beating. That's how it works. So there is this sort of thing of working class people, and it just shows you their background. They think, of course, I will put matchsticks under somebody's eyes and light them until they tell me where their gold dust is. Of course. There's nothing else to do. What are you talking about?
Oh my God. Okay.
Yeah.
So how like
Sorry, I
oh
wit you off topic a lot.
man. I'm a writer. You're giving me too many ideas, Izzy.
I'm sorry.
So like obviously like Pirates of the Caribbean's made for a more family friendly audience,
Mm.
but what were things in it that you remember that they got wrong in terms of
They got wrong. We
yeah like
can't stab a pirate and him not feel it. That's not right. I mean, it seems unfair to pick it apart because it is storytelling. I mean, the fact that the East India Company didn't operate in the West Indies should be obvious to anyone. Uh, Things like that. It's just like, no. I mean, it's very hard to work out when Pirates of the Caribbean is set, because you have people who are very obviously early 18th century, people like Jack Sparrow. They feel very early on golden age of piracy, but then the level of sort of redcoats that you have walking around the place feels very late 18th century. So you've got this sort of, and it's because you guys are obsessed with the American Revolutionary War, that little thing, right? And that's why, that's happening. They get very wrong the sailing. So I think there's, just the fact that it takes hours to position ships enough to fire cannon at them, and you can't fire all your cannons at one without splitting the ship apart. There's certain things. There's ships that sink. They're made of wood. There isn't a massive storm, and yet they sink. What happens if you have a fire on ship? That's the most scary thing you could possibly happen. Fire was the worst thing. You're in a massive thing that's a tinderbox. If fire happens, you will drown. It's awful. but you don't worry too much about sinking, because sinking isn't really a thing unless you're in a storm and you get completely waterlogged. It's the storm that's the issue. And so yeah, but it's just very minor things that I notice, like, you know, if it's the start of World's End, where you've got all of the pirates being hanged one after the other, all these children go yo ho hoist the colours, all of that sort of thing. Well, one, that only happened later on, right? The style of hanging is wrong, but I'll get to that. Most pirates before, I think, 1720 were hanged back in Tyburn in London, so they'd be transported to London to have the crowd see how evil they were, etc. And that's, you know, because that's where it mattered. That's where you needed to show it. So you didn't get it happening in the Caribbean. And when you did get it happening in the Caribbean, it wasn't the sort of thing under guard and that sort of thing. It wasn't. They've done a standard drop. Now, I love hanging as a history. There, they've got the American knot and rope, which isn't how British people hang you. Okay, you have a little eyelet on the end of the rope. You thread that through. The eyelet just goes there, and you hang like that. It's not that weird knot that you guys do. That's very American. It's not accurate. And you have the trapdoor with the drop. That standard drop, if you were lucky in the 18th century, did you get that? That wasn't standardized until like the 1790s. Previously, you just had that put around your neck, strung up, and hope that you die eventually. Phrases like, you know, the phrase pull my leg, that is so that your friends, when you were being hanged, would come along and they'd hang off your legs so they'd break your neck so you weren't suffering for too long. That's where that comes from.
Okay.
You know, it's things like, so hanging was, and there's many stories like you could pay the hangman and that sort of thing to get let down. That's true. People would be hanging and their mates would be going, here's some silver, please, can you let them down? I don't want them to die, please, like this. And there'd be conversations happening while they were dying. And the stories of people being let down, get this, you'd get pins and needles in your head.
They'd put actual pins and needles in your
No,
brain.
no. You know when your hand goes numb or your foot goes numb because you've been sitting down a while? We call that pins and needles, with that feeling where it hurts because it feels like loads of people poking you. What do you call that in America? When your foot goes numb, what do you call that? Do you have a phrase for that?
Falling asleep.
Yeah, so when your leg falls asleep and you know when it wakes up, it tingles and it's a bit painful, you get that in your face after being hanged. So they're not putting pins and needles in your face, it's just what you feel. And apparently that pain in your face as your, you know, the blood's coming back into your skin and everything else is so bad that people were asking to be killed. Well, that was going on. So, you know, but
I can't even imagine the brain damage from not having any blood in your brain either.
yeah, and it all, I mean, if you were heavy enough, it didn't matter that it was a short drop, you just die. I mean, by the 20th century, we had long drops, which were much more, which, you know, you'd have a long drop and yes, your heart would be beating, but it served, you know, take apart your upper spine, just crack those things there and then you're unconscious. So take you a while for your heart to stop beating, but that's far more humane. There's a guy, if only I could remember his name. Names just slip through my head, but he was a British hangman, hanged a lot of Nazis after the war, and he was like, I can get you from stepping into the execution chamber, you'd be dead within 11 seconds. That's that quick. That fishing. Wow. Hood on, drop, done.
Wow. Okay.
Didn't have time to panic.
Wow.
But that's not how pirates were done. Pirates were like, everybody watch this man struggle and kick his legs. Or women. But not as many women, you know. I think Mary Read and Anne Bonny managed to escape the noose because they were saying that they were pregnant, which might not have been true. And it likely is that both of them died of disease in prison. But nobody knows what happened to Anne Bonny. Technically, she could have got away. Technically, she probably died in prison. But technically, she could have got away. So, who knows? Anyway.
So how many, do we know the exact number of how many women became pirates?
No, because I imagine a lot more than we think. Because women in general were not allowed, like, there's a lot of superstition around women. And imagine, just simply because of how many turn up in later wars and everything else. When you're working on this sailor, he's been injured, and you go, "Oh my goodness, he has boobs and doesn't have a willy. This must mean," there's a lot of women who dress up as men and just join the navy and also become pirates for the same reason, who never let their secret be known. And it's some of it might be a trans issue. I kind of doubt it. It's more of an, not being a blooming maid or a housewife, basically effective a house slave issue. So women will just go, I don't want to do this for the rest of my life. Thank you very much. I'm going to be a man. Oh, this is also quite terrible, but hey. So so we don't know exact numbers. When they found out about it, so Anne Bonny was rare because she actually, went as a woman. I think she did things like she flashed her chest at people to get them to shut up and that sort of thing, which is pretty cool. And Mary Read, Anne Bonny fancied Mary Read because she thought she was a man, and then when she wasn't a man, they became friends, but they weren't, star-crossed lovers. And Anne Bonny was going out with Calico Jack at the time anyway. But point is, most women who went into piracy did so as men, so we don't know.
Okay. All right. And do we know how, like how many women, or do we know, or like how many female pirates out there managed to get away with not getting, or the ones that are known?
I mean, the trouble is I'm very Caribbean based. I know there's a really successful female pirate in the China Seas, but I don't know of any.
Hmm.
But that doesn't mean there weren't any. Not only because they won't be recorded as having got away, because that looks a bit bad, but also I have not done enough research on it, probably. So there's probably pirate historians here going, well, actually, and I'm just like, fair enough. Like I say, I do very specific researches for the topics I know. I'm a generalist, so I can put everything together, but there are really cool people who will tangle apart all the
Know
other
the
stuff.
exacts.
Yeah. See, I had to, for my, I know, for example, I know enough about sailing now because I researched the history of sailing so much that I know that a Bermudan sloop back in the early 18th century was gaff rigged, even though modern Bermudan sloops are not gaff rigged. These are things that I know because they're specific to what I would needed to research in order to make my books the most realistic I could. I can tell you all about sort of like types of chairs in America. So like, the wingback chairs and the coneback chairs of the late 18th century. However, that won't help anybody. So you have to understand who you're dealing with. You're not dealing with a historian who's an expert on a specific time period. I'm an historian who's an expert on a specific story and the world around that story that makes sense to that story. So yeah, speaking to a limited person, I'm not an official historian. I'm just a
Okay.
history fan.
Yeah. Well, speaking of the limits, what about Caribbean life that often gets overlooked when with
I
piracy?
mean, yeah, just the. I mean, way it's depicted in film, and that's the slavery. You just don't see it.
You
It's
don't
just not
ever.
there. You don't. I mean, can you think of a pirate film where you see loads of slaves?
No.
And it's like the main thing. That's why the Caribbean is so rich. Is because it's got loads of really expensive crops like tobacco and sugarcane, and there are people farming that for free. That is why it's so rich and wealthy, and that is why you get so many people. So that anyway, that's what I would argue is the main ridiculous thing about piracy is you just don't see and as depicted in our culture. You just don't see who is doing it. You don't see the people who are actually there at the time, which is just sad. Which is, yeah, why, despite being as white as a toilet, I need to write about, people other than white people when I write about history because they were there and they were the reason it was happening.
Yeah. Oh, unfortunate is. Um,
Yeah.
what are some of the things that it's interesting because I initially found you through your review of pirate movies.
Oh,
Um,
yeah, and history hit.
exactly.
Yeah.
And so, what are some of the things that as for filmmakers, for people that are going to be making
Mm.
content of this, what are things that you suggest or notice that maybe should be?
I think with pirate stuff, I mean, particularly anything set at sea, really focus on the sailing nature because that is actually really interesting and exciting. The fact that the actual notion of being on a boat, how long it takes to do stuff, what's actually possible on a ship and what isn't, because even though it seems less boom, 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 exciting, when the cannon does go off, that is really, that is an amazing thing. How many people does it take to go cannon? What happens if a cannon explodes in the ship? All of that sort of stuff, how scary it is being in a ship, how dark it is, all of these things that make filmmakers go, but I hate doing scenes in the dark, you know. So I would really focus on the nature of sailing because it is so dangerous and so bizarre. Because this is, like it changes the way you think about pirates at all because they're doing something already completely risky and they're taking more risks and they're you have to, like, we're very used to in our sort of age of going, oh well, next decade I'll do this when I'm in my 40s and I'll do this when I'm in my 50s and that sort of thing. Well, no, they literally went, next month I might do this if I'm not dead. That's the attitude that you've got to sort of like put in there. They're not schemed. I mean, one of the things about Blackbeard was at least he was a schemer up to about a year in advance, and that was seen as very, foresight. And how young people are. This is one thing when you have Blackbeard's, depicted as a man in his 50s. I mean, he was long living. He lived to about 38. This is, you were expected, and the lack of children. Where are all the kids? Kids were working. There were plenty of kids around. You don't, and I know we have all these fine actors who are all sort of worked really hard and they get, but most people in history who were doing all this stuff were not old. Even in old films like The Seahawk, which is a film basically about Sir Francis Drake without naming him, but it's called The Seahawk, that sort of thing. You have guys, all of the people around Queen Elizabeth, they look like they're guys in their 60s and 70s, but in reality they would have been 30s, 40s, maybe a few 50s in there as well. They wouldn't have been these, and young men as well. To see somebody in the street older than 40, they're seen as very old and wise. Go back to Tudor times, you'd be just amazed at how young everybody is. And having kids in their, early, well, that's quite usual in America, aren't you? You marry young still, some of you. Some of the states, Tennessee and stuff, usual to marry in your early 20s. In the UK, that's quite rare still. So people usually marry mid-20s to mid-30s generally. But yeah, the idea of, and just the lack of children. There are children everywhere. Couldn't stop them.
Wow. Okay, so was it normal to see kids on pirate ships?
Yeah, well, of course. I mean, and kids, not just pirate ships, but all ships. Kids, you'd have specific jobs that are very good for kids because the actual process of being on a ship, lots of heavy manual work, but it didn't mean there weren't smaller jobs that you needed kids on the ship to do. So, for example, you've heard of powder monkeys. The word powder monkey is literally because you can't keep the gunpowder in the same place as the cannon, because if that gunpowder ignites, that can start a fire. Fire is the worst thing you can possibly have on a ship. So therefore, you need somebody to go to the gun room, to the powder room, which is where you keep the powder. That all gets made in there, packed, taken out, run up to the deck by someone, child, to be given to the people operating the cannon, where it was all pushed down, and it would take, if you could fire a cannon more than once a minute, you're a genius. But yeah, several men firing each cannon, and that is, and you can't be lackadaisical and not careful with that, because if you start a fire, the battle is over. You can't put out, if you've got a big enough blaze on a ship, that's it. And the idea that all cannonball are just giant metal balls. They can't make things unless they hit, like, there's a candle and it hits some gunpowder. You're not going to get an explosion by just metal going in. All that's doing is there to create shrapnel to kill people. That's all the cannonballs for. Maybe if you're good, you can knock down a few masts, but really you're going after just killing people as much as you can. And yeah, splinters. That's what pirate films lack. Splinters.
Everybody got splinters.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the whole thing was made out of wood. You're going to get splinters. Um, it's, but you know, and also just the constant upkeep ships take. Just the Caribbean, there's a thing called shipworm, which is a type of barnacle that eats wood. So you've got to take your ship out of the water regularly, scrub all the shipworm off, otherwise it won't last at all. You've also got all of the, ships, porous. Water comes in. You've got to constantly, like, there's a seam in the ship called the Devil. And you've heard of Between the Devil and the Deep Blue Sea? That is like one of the worst jobs on the ship because you've got to come off the side of the ship and you've got to basically use pitch and tar to fill in the devil, which is a constant job. It's a bit like painting the San Francisco, Golden Gate Bridge. You can't ever stop doing that because by the time you've gone all the way around the ship, it needs doing again. It's the constant upkeep of ships and the constant looking after of them. All of these sort of torn sails. I'm sorry, but no. It's they degrade really quickly. And of course, if you're a pirate, how are you going to get your ship out of the water? Because you've got to have a safe dock, which is why you get, in certain times of history, Port Royal, later on Nassau, are places where pirates could do ship repairs, which is why there were hubs of pirates. And you needed to have a hub of pirates. You needed a place that you could stay for a while where you won't get arrested. You weren't risking arrest because it was run, by pirates for pirates, effectively. And it's why when Woodes Rogers says we're going to come and try and take over, he really fails to do a good job of taking over because the governors all flee, because they're not supported. They don't have enough men to support, and the pirates just take over. So anyway, but the point is, there's a lot of unrealistic stuff in film. Unless you've got, I mean, other than, as I think I said in that, Miss Piggy is perfect as Benjamina Gunn. I love her that very much.
So guys like Blackbeard must have always had figured out ways, even outside of Port Royal, how to upkeep their ships.
Yeah, but it's hard. I mean, I don't. The thing is, because the only evidence, so you can go online and you can read like the Boston newsletter, which is one of the original sources I actually use, of people being So the only evidence we have Blackbeard, he didn't keep the records. We're only getting reported stuff of the people he stopped. So because he's not killing them all, so they're reporting back saying that he took this and he took that and he's on his way here and he did that and we saw him here and we saw him there. And that's how you can fill in his story and work out which way he was going and which direction he was going. And so we don't know how they were managing a lot of the stuff. We don't know the disrepair some of the ships are in. I have a fictional ship in my book called Salt Pig, and that one really is like falling to bits, and it is like got a rip in the sail. You've got planks of wood splintering everywhere. It's only just keeping it together, and that's quite a sort of like ship to be on. But and if you go to Nassau at the time, because they were commandeering ships, so they're just dropping people off at ports, or they were dropping people off, marooning them on islands. Oh no! But it's quite easy to get picked up again because there's a lot of shipping. But Nassau had like carcasses of ships everywhere and they weren't stripped. People assume, oh, but this is very valuable items, they would have stripped them and done it, but they were pirates. They didn't care. They weren't planning for the future. They weren't being really efficient, and that's the thing. So you had cannon and like gunpowder just rotting, and like there was there's a story that one of them had like commandeered a ship and got a load of leather and like hides, brilliant, but it wasn't treated, so it was just left to rot in the sun. So Nassau stank of rotting flesh for about 3 weeks while all of this leather just rotted away. But so yeah, it's that thing of they're not efficient, they're not looking after these vessels because they don't have to last as long, but equally we don't have records of what they were doing precisely because they weren't keeping them. So we only have the small little, like these snapshots. It's a bit like, dinosaur fossils. We only have this little snapshot of what was around. We don't have the whole picture.
Okay. That is a pretty interesting thought. I mean, so much not documented.
Yeah. I mean, most of history isn't.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. It's not like now where we can check his texts, see what his is on WhatsApp. Can't do that.
I know that's going to be the benefit of WhatsApp and all those other digital archives.
Yeah. But it is, I do recommend to anybody because, like I say, I do not have a formal academic background in history. My background's geography. I do have degrees and stuff. I'm clever, but and a lot of that involved historical research. But I don't want. It's one of the things I tell kids is I just don't want you to think that this is exclusively for you and this is exclusively for you. Anybody can pick up any book and try and build a little picture of themselves and have a go at, even for fun. I find writing stories and that sort of thing a really great way to sort of like say, well, what's this? Julius Caesar was captured by pirates. What did those pirates think? Well, you can read Julius Caesar's account. Why not write the pirates' account just for your, satisfaction? It's kind of fun to, we sort of do this as kids. We make pretends. And as a grown up, you can make pretend so much better because you know where to look and you know where to find out stuff. And it becomes fun. Even if you're just doing it to, like, if you're an artist and you want to create an accurate portrait, then you can say, oh, well, let's look at other paintings this time. What's they including in their paintings? Why are they including those in their paintings? What can I include in my painting that's slightly different to that, but references it, that says something about this person's character, all of these different things. Even if you're doing fantasy and you're a DM master and that sort of thing, and you're trying to make something really exciting, you can use bits of real history in your storytelling, which makes it just come alive. Because what we've been fed by the media is so limiting, and actually what's out there is so bizarre and exciting that it just blows your mind. And that's why I love history.
Yeah, yeah. No, it adds so much more to study the real stuff in history.
Yeah.
There's just such a higher level of everything to it, and it's so much fun.
Yeah, and the advantage of, like, if you think, well, I don't know anything about how ships work or anything like that, there are nerds online everywhere. You have dudes who will write about the type of rope used in this type of vessel versus that type of vessel and how this changed over time. And you can read them, you can ask them questions. I mean, that's a wonderful thing about the internet now, is everything's opened up a bit. And worst thing that happens is people don't email you back or people don't respond to you, which is, fine, they don't have to. But, even if you can ask somebody for some pointers, it's utterly great. But I will say, if you want to research pirates, I found, I think it's Colin Woodward's The Republic of Pirates to be the best book for the period I'm talking about. I found, one, is very readable because he can write, and two, having read around a lot of different pirate books and a lot of it, I agree with him most. I think
Okay.
he's the one I go. He's the one I go. Well, that makes sense for that reason, and that makes sense for that reason. And like I said, there's a few things I'm a bit like, well, that could have been different there because this person said. But ultimately, I'm a Colin Woodward fan, so he's a great. Like, if you're going to get into it, Republic of Pirates is the book I go to.
Excellent. Excellent. So, are there any pirates out there in history that you feel as though have not been given enough attention, or moments
Ooh.
that you feel like now is your time to shed a little bit of a spotlight on them?
Um, I mean, I to be honest, like, all of the ones that I mean, Blackbeard's obviously a big one. I think there's a couple, and they've got the same name, and they're called Black Caesar. I mean, the trouble with Black Caesar is that all we really know about him is he was part of Blackbeard's crew. So this is the one I'm talking about. There's one later on in the, I think he might be 19th century even, but I think maybe late 18th century. But the one I'm talking about, all we know about him is he's of African origin. He might have been born in the Caribbean though, but he's definitely black, and he was part of of Blackbeard's crew. But when Blackbeard sold his crew when he took the king's pardon, he didn't sell Black Caesar, and him and Black Caesar were very close, to the point that when Blackbeard had died, Black Caesar kept on fighting and tried to blow up the British who had got him, or the people who got him. So it was, in a very sort of like last minute, last heroic thing. And Black Caesar, I mean, I don't think we can do much more research about him because he's just, one, he's a pirate, so he didn't keep very good records or any. Two, there are no he's mentioned occasionally, by people, but he doesn't have this sort of pedigree background of where did he come from, was he a freed slave, was he a merchant, why did he join Blackbeard. All of this we just do not know, but he was obviously special, and obviously somebody, and he's big part of Blackbeard's treasure. He's huge in it. But that's all stuff that I've just gone, I want a Han Solo character, so I'm making him. It's that sort of, that's me fantasizing rather than the actual history. And I wish there were a way that we could get that. I sort of place him as a merchant from Nigeria, really, is his background, but I have no idea what he really
It's
was. He really existed. He was there.
yeah. Even though he's a pirate, he has this very well-spoken, mannered, sophisticated.
Well, exactly. Well, he speaks Yoruba, and he speaks English, and he speaks a bit of Dutch too. So very he's very good. But that's the thing. Multiple languages really helps in the Caribbean: French, Dutch, English, Yoruba, Tree. But all of these, and obviously this is where Jamaican patois comes from, and you can see the origins of all these different, even like the pacing of the language, all of this thing, all the musicality. It's all come from, early 18th century or mid 18th century Africa, and you just don't, yeah, it's influenced us a lot, a lot.
Yeah.
So it's this weird thing about colonialism, is how much, we always see it as, oh, we've completely erased all of these histories and that sort of thing. And I sort of think, would the American Revolution happened if we hadn't seen one, there's pirates on one side, but if we hadn't seen Native American peoples talking around, and would the coffee shop have happened in that sort of sense, that this whole idea of men gathering together, sharing ideas, passing the peace pipe, would that influence, which caused all of this different thinking, caused the end of all this feudalism, are those ideas not, they came from somewhere, and they didn't come exclusively from the West. They came from Africa, they came from America. And so you're kind of thinking, yeah, all of these cultures were destroyed and decimated and just treated appallingly, but they're there. We are very much of those people as much as we are of the Knights of the Realm, and so not talking about them is basically doing ourselves a disservice, even if, like you say, you can go all the way back in my past and we're very boring, been in Britain for ages, but
Well, there's always a lot of details and layers to history everywhere you go.
Hmm.
I
But
mean,
I mean, the history of ideas is really interesting, because
it,
why did we start up all these coffee shops when we did? Would Britain have cut the head off their king if they hadn't seen that? Oh, hang on, there's a load of people living without kings and doing quite well. Interesting.
yeah.
You know.
Also, the idea of a coffee shop too in the Middle of the East was
Yeah,
considered like super debaucherous.
yeah.
It
It's
would
all,
be a place
yeah,
with influence to commit sin or something like that.
yeah. And also, yeah, just because they weren't allowed booze, you know, so coffee was the thing. But you can argue that a lot of the slavery that went on, and the Barbary pirates and the Barbary coast as well in the Mediterranean. There's this lovely little. This is completely irrelevant. There's a lovely little story of a guy from Venice telling his mate, saying, "Oh look, here comes one of those ships from um, from Middle East." And he's like, "How can you tell it's from the Middle East?" Because all you see are the people rowing the boat. And he goes, "Well, all the people rowing the boat are white. That's how you know it's from the Middle East, because they've got white slaves. How do you know that the boat's coming from France or somewhere else? Because their slaves are Middle Eastern." That's how you know. It's a really weird thing. But
It
that's
is.
very different to the transatlantic slave trade, which was another level. So the slavery that was going on in Europe, very different.
Very different.
Very different. It
All right.
wasn't. Yeah, you want to keep your slaves alive, basically. That's the
Yeah.
difference.
Yeah. Um, so my last question is, do you have a message for future generations?
Other than history is fun, so do history, even if you're not a historian. And storytelling is fun as well, so do that.
All right. Thank you, Izzy.
Thank you very much. Lovely to meet you.